940 kilometers. That was the distance between the Ukrainian launch point and the target. Not a frontline depot, not a forward ammunition point within artillery range, a rear area arsenal, the kind Russian planners considered untouchable, the kind they filled with everything needed to sustain an entire offensive. Artillery shells, rocket motors, propellant charges, guided munitions. Thousands of tons of ordnance stacked in open-earth revetments because distribution speed mattered more than concealment. Because no Ukrainian weapon had ever reached this far before. They were wrong about that. The fireball was visible for over 200 kilometers. The shockwave shattered windows in the nearest town. Secondary detonations ran for hours. A chain reaction that turned one strike into a catastrophe no Russian logistics officer will ever forget. And the satellite image that captured the smoke column showed something that took analysts a moment to process. The cloud was tall enough, wide enough, and dense enough to register as meteorological interference on weather satellites. This is what happens when a force stops being afraid of distance. When Ukrainian engineers and drone operators decide that 940 kilometers is just a number, and numbers can be solved. I'm your host at Ukraine Radar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today we're taking you inside the mission that shook Russian rear area doctrine. A long-range strike that threaded 940 kilometers of contested airspace to reach an ammunition depot Russian planners believed was beyond any possible threat. They believed that right up until the first warhead hit. Stay with us. Because what unfolds over the next several hours of that night is not just a strike mission. It's a lesson in how a smaller force, outgunned on the front line, reaches behind the curtain and tears out the supply chain that makes the entire Russian offensive possible. This is the anatomy of deep strike. This is Ukraine Radar. To understand the target, you need to understand the problem it was solving for Russia. The Southern Front had been consuming ammunition at rates that strained even Russia's industrial base. Artillery tubes were firing 300 rounds per day per battery. Rocket artillery systems were cycling through magazines faster than convoys could deliver. The solution Russian logistics commanders adopted was centralization. Instead of distributing small ammunition points across the front, they built large, consolidated arsenals deeper in the rear, presumed safe, and pushed high-speed distribution convoys forward from there. In theory, this reduced convoy vulnerability near the front line. In practice, it created something far more dangerous: a single point of failure. A target so valuable that destroying it would not just inconvenience one unit, it would starve an entire operational axis. Ukrainian military intelligence had been watching this depot for months. Satellite imagery passed through NATO partner channels showed steady growth of stockpiles. Open-source analysts tracking supply convoy patterns noticed the flow increasing. In signals intelligence, intercepts of Russian logistics communications that Ukrainian SIGINT teams had become exceptionally skilled at exploiting confirmed what the imagery suggested. This depot was feeding the entire Southern Front. Tens of thousands of rounds, hundreds of rocket pods, guided munitions that Russian forces were using to hit Ukrainian cities and frontline positions alike. The depot sat in a broad river valley, surrounded by agricultural land. The nearest significant settlement was close enough that the explosion would be felt. Russian planners had positioned air defense assets in the region, but coverage was oriented toward threats coming from Ukrainian territory. Standard intercept geometry for cruise missiles or ballistic threats flying relatively direct paths at detectable altitudes. They had not planned for what was coming. The Ukrainian strike package was built around long-range loitering munitions, a new generation of domestically produced UAVs that Ukrainian engineers had been developing and refining through the full-scale war. These were not commercial quadcopters repurposed for FPV kamikaze attacks. These were purpose-built weapons. Fixed-wing platforms with low radar cross-sections, fuel-efficient propulsion systems designed for extended range, and navigation packages combining pre-programmed waypoint routing with terminal guidance options, including electro-optical and infrared seekers. The vehicles used in this operation had a nominal range exceeding 1,000 kilometers, a cruising altitude that could be varied between 50 and 500 meters above ground level to exploit terrain masking, and a warhead sufficient to initiate the secondary detonations that would do the real work. Because against a target like this, an ammunition depot packed with propellant and explosive filler, the initial warhead was almost secondary. The goal was not to destroy individual munitions through direct effect. The goal was ignition. Which weapon was more decisive in deep strike operations? The carrier UAV that delivers the initial warhead, or the secondary detonation chain it triggers? Think about that. The answer might surprise you. Comment your analysis below. We'll come back to it. The planning cycle was long. Ukrainian targeting teams spent weeks developing the route package. A direct line approach from Ukrainian territory would have crossed the airspace that Russian radar networks were most densely covering. The route chosen was anything but direct. It curved north, skirting radar coverage gaps that Ukrainian SIGINT had identified through months of electronic emissions mapping. It flew low through river valleys and across forested terrain where the radar horizon was broken by natural features. It used timing to avoid known Russian patrol aircraft windows. The flight path was over 940 kilometers long, but the actual straight-line distance to the target was significantly shorter. The route added distance deliberately, as tactical camouflage. Every kilometer of detour was a kilometer of radar coverage avoided. The strike package consisted of multiple vehicles, not a single drone threading a single path, but a coordinated wave designed with redundancy. If electronic warfare knocked down one or two, others would continue. If a radar network acquired one, the others flying different headings at different altitudes would not necessarily be caught by the same engagement geometry. The target was too valuable for a single-point mission profile. Launch occurred in the early morning hours, during the window when Russian air defense operator attention is statistically lowest, and when darkness still covered the initial route legs. Ukrainian operators at ground stations monitored telemetry feeds as the vehicles climbed to initial cruise altitude and began navigating the first waypoints. The atmosphere was tense. Not dramatic the way movies portray it. Quiet. Intense. Each data point confirming the vehicles were on course, on speed, flying clean. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes destroys the confidence of an entire Russian rear area command. The first indication something was wrong, from the Russian perspective, came from a mobile radar station operating in the general region of the depot. It detected a contact. Low, slow, moving on a heading that didn't fit standard commercial aviation patterns. The operator logged it, queried the air defense network. Got back, nothing definitive. The contact was at the edge of detection capability, intermittent, the kind of ghost return that operators see dozens of times per shift. This was the obstacle. The Ukrainian flight path had been plotted to create exactly this ambiguity. Not invisible. Invisibility is not achievable for a fixed-wing platform of any size at any altitude, but ambiguous, confusing. Fitting the signature of a bird flock, a sensor artifact, a civilian ultralight on an irregular heading. The Russian operator had to make a decision without enough data to make it confidently. And the air defense network coordination that might have fused multiple sensor returns into a coherent track was slower than the situation required. By the time a missile battery was alerted and began elevating its engagement radar, the contact had dropped back below the detection threshold, flying a valley, using terrain. Gone from the picture. The vehicles pressed on. How many vehicles reached the target area and initiated the strike sequence? Hold that question. We'll give you the verified answer at the end, but the number was enough. More than enough. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Not the headlines, not the propaganda, but the mechanics of what happens when intelligence, engineering, and operational planning come together at range. The depot came into sensor range for the lead vehicle approximately 40 minutes before first light. The electro-optical seeker, operating in low-light mode, began building a picture of the target. Pre-mission intelligence had provided detailed imagery, the layout of the revetments, the access roads between storage bays, the administrative structures, the fuel point. Analysts had identified the highest value aim points. The sections of the depot where imagery suggested the densest concentration of propellant-heavy munitions, the configurations most likely to trigger chain reaction detonations. The lead vehicle navigated to its designated approach heading, speed reduced, altitude adjusted. The terminal phase of a strike like this is not a straight dive at the target. It's a precise approach that positions the warhead at the exact angle and location calculated to maximize ignition probability. Propellant fires differently depending on how the initial ignition point is positioned relative to surrounding stock. Analysts had done the math. The operators trusted the math. At 3:17 a.m., the first warhead detonated. The initial explosion was not the spectacle. It was the spark. A single revetment bay, containing what Ukrainian intelligence assessed as artillery propellant charges, caught. The initial detonation was a white flash, visible on the vehicle's rearward sensor before it completed its terminal run. Then the fire spread. Not instantly. There was a delay of approximately 12 seconds, the kind of delay that in another context might let a fire crew intervene. There was no fire crew intervention at 3:17 a.m. No organized response at all in the first minute. At 3:18 a.m., the secondary detonations began. A propellant fire, once established in a stacked storage environment, does not behave like a conventional structural fire. Propellant is designed to release energy rapidly. When one pellet ignites, it radiates heat at a rate that ignites adjacent stacks faster than any firefighting response can address. The chain moves faster than it can be interrupted. And when the fire reaches munitions with explosive filler, artillery shells, rocket warheads, the progression stops being a fire and becomes a series of explosions. The second detonation was larger than the first. The third was larger than the second. By the time the fourth and fifth detonations occurred, they were overlapping in time, barely distinguishable as individual events, blurring into a continuous roar that residents of the nearest town would later describe as something that didn't sound like an explosion at all. It sounded like continuous thunder during a storm that didn't stop. The question every analyst asked afterward was the same question Russian logistics planners should have asked before they built this depot. What happens if it burns? The answer, playing out in satellite imagery and infrasound sensor data and commercial aircraft transponder diversions, was categorical. It burns for hours. It burns until there is nothing left to burn. If you believe tactics win wars, type Ukraine radar in the comments. Because what happened next is the part that Russian commanders will spend years trying to explain away. The air defense response, once finally organized, was directed at the wrong problem. Missiles were fired into airspace sectors where the strike vehicles were no longer present. By the time the engagement geometry was established, the UAVs that had survived the initial approach were already aggressing on their outbound routes. The air defense network was engaging ghosts, or in some cases, engaging nothing at all, firing into sectors designated by a command system working from stale data and panicked coordination. Intercepted communications, which Ukrainian SIGINT teams were monitoring in near real time, captured the chaos in Russian air defense coordination. A regimental air defense commander demanding to know from his battery commanders what was in the air. Battery commanders reporting conflicting radar contacts. A frantic exchange about whether the depot fire was the result of a drone strike or a technical accident. Because accepting that it was a drone strike meant accepting that something had crossed 940 kilometers of theoretically defended airspace. That denial, that instinct to categorize the catastrophe as an accident rather than an operation, cost Russian command critical minutes of coordinated response time. The fire burned through the morning. Satellite imagery acquired after dawn showed a smoke column rising to over 6,000 meters, high enough to be tracked as a meteorological feature by weather observation systems. The imagery showed the depot's revetment grid as a pattern of craters and scorched earth. The administrative buildings had collapsed from overpressure. The access roads were blocked by debris. A fuel point on the eastern perimeter had also ignited, adding petroleum smoke to the ammunition smoke in a column that shifted northwest with the morning wind. The town closest to the depot reported structural damage to multiple buildings. Windows blown in, roof tiles displaced, one residential structure with partial wall collapse from overpressure. No reports of civilian casualties from the overpressure effects, but the psychological impact on the population was significant. A town that had been told it was hundreds of kilometers from any possible Ukrainian threat had just experienced a shockwave strong enough to break windows and knock children from their beds. Russian state media, in the hours after the strike, attributed the depot fire to technical causes. By the following day, that narrative had been quietly revised to acknowledge enemy drone activity. By the day after that, the official position was focused on the response, on the air defense measures taken, on the criminals responsible for the attack, rather than on the scale of the loss. The scale of the loss was not something Russian officials wanted the public calculating. Ukrainian General Staff reports in the days following the strike provided assessment figures. The depot had contained an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 artillery shells, plus associated propellant charges. Rocket munitions sufficient to sustain multiple MLRS systems for weeks of intensive firing. Guided air defense missiles, anti-tank guided munitions, vehicle-mounted weapons systems in pre-positioned storage. The total value of the destroyed stockpile, calculated at procurement costs, ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. What would NATO planners have done differently to defend a high-value rear-area logistics node against this type of threat? Comment your tactical analysis below. The best responses get read in our next breakdown. But the monetary value was almost secondary. What mattered operationally was the timeline. Russian forces on the southern front had been drawing from this depot daily. The vehicles and convoys that normally departed loaded with artillery ammunition and drove forward to frontline battery positions would not be departing. The ammunition those battery positions needed to maintain their standard rate of fire was not going to arrive on schedule. The artillery suppression that Russian infantry had been relying on to move forward against Ukrainian defensive positions was going to be reduced, suddenly, sharply, without warning. This was the ripple effect that Ukrainian planners had calculated and that Russian planners had failed to account for. A depot at this distance from the front was not just storage. It was the beating heart of a logistics system. Stop the heart, and the extremities feel it within hours. The obstacle to this ripple effect, the thing that could have blunted the operational impact, was Russian logistics redundancy. If there were other depots of similar capacity within range of the affected front, the supply system could partially compensate, and there were other depots. But none were positioned to fully absorb the loss without disruption. The centralization strategy that had made this depot such a high-value target had also made the logistics network more brittle than a distributed system would have been. Russian logistics commanders began emergency redistribution operations within 48 hours. Convoys were rerouted. Draw authority was shifted to secondary depots. Forward ammunition points were ordered to conserve stocks. All of this took time. All of this created exactly the kind of gap in artillery support that Ukrainian forces on the southern front exploited in the days that followed. Ukrainian infantry units reported a measurable decrease in incoming artillery fire in the 72 hours after the depot strike. Not silence. The front never goes completely silent, but a reduction that was tactically significant. Positions that had been under sustained suppression found themselves able to move during daylight hours. Observation posts that had been driven underground by artillery found better fields of view. The reduction in Russian fire was not dramatic enough to trigger a major Ukrainian offensive, but it created breathing room, operational space, the kind of relief that frontline units measure in lives rather than kilometers. The engineering lesson embedded in this operation was not lost on the Ukrainian defense community. The vehicles that flew 940 kilometers through defended airspace had done so because of years of investment in range, signature reduction, and navigation autonomy. The Ukrainian Domestic Drone Development Program, which had expanded dramatically over the course of the full-scale war, drawing on a base of engineering talent in the technology sector and accelerated by the urgency of national survival, had produced platforms that could be manufactured at scale, launched from dispersed positions, and guided to targets that conventional aircraft could not reach, safely. This was Ukraine's answer to the range problem. Russia had deep strategic depth. Its rear areas had always been considered sanctuaries. The ability to reach those sanctuaries with precision-guided munitions, even munitions with warheads smaller than those of cruise missiles, changed the character of the conflict. Every Russian logistics node was now potentially at risk. Every depot, every fuel point, every railway junction where military supplies transferred from train to truck. The psychological effect on Russian logistics planning was real and measurable. In the weeks after the depot strike, satellite imagery began showing changes in how Russian rear area storage facilities were being managed. Dispersal of stockpiles that had previously been consolidated, increased use of camouflage netting and concealment measures, repositioning of some storage to locations with better overhead cover, inside structures rather than in open revetments. These defensive measures had costs. Dispersed stockpiles are harder to manage, harder to distribute efficiently, harder to track in inventory systems. The concealment measures added time to the load cycle for convoy operations. The repositioning of storage created logistical inefficiencies. Every adaptation that Russian logistics made in response to the threat of Ukrainian long-range drones made the Russian supply system marginally less efficient than it had been before. Multiply that marginal inefficiency across hundreds of logistics nodes, across thousands of convoy runs, across months of sustained operations, and the cumulative effect on Russian offensive capability was significant. This is how deep strike works at the strategic level. Not through a single dramatic blow that ends the conflict. Through a sustained campaign of precision strikes against the supply architecture that makes continued operations possible. Ukraine had learned this lesson, and Ukraine was applying it with increasing sophistication and reach. The drone operators who flew this mission were not household names. They worked in facilities that Ukrainian security services protected carefully, in teams that rotated between operational and maintenance duties, with the kind of professional discipline that comes from knowing that each mission has real consequences. They monitored telemetry feeds for hours. They made navigation adjustments when sensor returns suggested radar attention. They held the strike geometry through the final approach phase with the kind of patience that separates effective operations from hasty ones. When the first secondary detonation registered on their feeds, a flash of thermal bloom far larger than the initial warhead signature, There was no celebration, just confirmation. Target achieved. Vehicles continuing on egress heading. Post-strike assessment collecting. 0 losses in the strike element. The vehicles that survived the approach and completed their terminal runs were either recovered to pre-positioned recovery points or, in cases where fuel margin was exhausted, brought down in controlled terminal approaches away from sensitive areas. The vehicles lost to Russian electronic warfare or air defense fire had been accounted for in mission planning as acceptable attrition for a target of this value. This is what modern Ukrainian doctrine looks like, not the heroic cavalry charge, not the mass tank battle of the Soviet model. Precision. Patience. Engineering. A 940-kilometer flight plan executed over hours in the dark, delivering warheads to coordinates calculated weeks in advance by analysts who had never set foot anywhere near the target, and who didn't need to. Real tactics. Real consequences. Ukraine radar. The battle damage assessment, compiled over the following week from satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and open-source monitoring of Russian logistics communications, painted a picture that exceeded initial projections. The depot had been assessed before the strike as containing supplies sufficient to sustain frontline artillery operations for approximately 3 weeks. The post-strike assessment indicated that the vast majority of those supplies had been destroyed or rendered inaccessible. 3 weeks of artillery ammunition. Gone in hours, replaced by a crater field and a logistics crisis that Russian commanders were still working to address days after the fire burned itself out. The crater field itself was extraordinary in extent. A depot of this size, when it burns and detonates, does not produce a neat blast circle. It produces a pattern of overlapping craters and debris fields that reflects the storage layout. Each revetment bay that cooked off left its own signature. Analysts counting craters in satellite imagery could reconstruct the approximate storage map from the damage pattern. The count ran into dozens of individual detonation events, each leaving a signature in the earth that would remain visible to satellite observation for months. The nearest town, whose residents had experienced the shockwave, was visited by Russian officials in the aftermath. Promises of compensation for property damage. Explanations focused on Ukrainian aggression. The framing carefully constructed to position the town's residents as victims of Ukrainian attack rather than as collateral of a military logistics operation they hadn't been told was in their neighborhood. Whether those residents found that framing persuasive is a separate question. What satellite imagery showed in the days after the strike was activity consistent with cleanup and recovery operations at the depot site. Not reconstruction of storage capacity, but removal of debris and damaged material. The depot, as a functioning logistics node, was finished. Rebuilding equivalent capacity elsewhere would take months. The Ukrainian drone operators knew none of the downstream details in real time. They knew the secondary detonations had run for hours, visible on feeds and confirmed by third-party satellite observation. They knew the target had been destroyed. The ripple effects on frontline artillery rates, on Russian logistics, emergency procedures, on the psychological calculus of Russian planners regarding rear area security. Those effects would unfold over days and weeks, analyzed by different teams in different facilities. But the mission was complete. The distance had been solved. The target that was supposed to be beyond reach had been reached. And somewhere in a Russian military district headquarters, a general was trying to explain to his superior how an ammunition depot 940 kilometers from the front line, in a country where Ukrainian strikes were not supposed to reach, had just ceased to exist. That explanation did not go well. This is what changes wars. Not always the dramatic frontline battle where armor meets armor and infantry fights for ground. Sometimes it's the quiet operation in the dark, the 900-kilometer flight plan, the warhead finding the ignition point, the logistics node that everyone believed was safe until it wasn't, the supply chain that everyone counted on until it stopped. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. Now, the answer to the question we posed earlier, how many strike vehicles reached the target area and initiated the strike sequence? Based on post-mission reporting and satellite analysis of the damage pattern, Ukrainian sources confirm the strike was executed by a formation of between 6 and 9 long-range UAVs, of which at least 4 completed successful terminal runs against designated aim points within the depot. The secondary detonation chain was initiated by the first successful hit and propagated from there, meaning that even if only a fraction of the strike package had survived the 940-kilometer approach, the mission would have succeeded. That's redundancy planning. That's how you build a strike operation against a target you cannot afford to miss. The tactical lesson here cuts both ways. For Ukraine, deep strike works. It works against targets that conventional doctrine considered safe. It works at ranges that previous generations of military planners would have called unrealistic for unmanned systems. And it works because Ukrainian engineers and operators have spent years making it work, iterating on every variable: range, signature, navigation, terminal guidance, warhead placement, with the kind of operational feedback loop that only comes from fighting a real war against a real opponent. For Russia, centralization is a vulnerability. Building large, consolidated logistics nodes because they're efficient is rational, until they become single points of failure for an opponent who can reach them. The decision to stack tens of thousands of artillery rounds in open revetments in a depot that assumed distance was its primary defense was a doctrinal error of the first order. Distance is no longer a defense when your opponent has 900-kilometer drones and the patience to plan the route carefully. Was the decision to centralize Russian rear area logistics a rational adaptation to frontline vulnerability? Or a catastrophic miscalculation that Ukrainian deep strike capability made inevitable? Think about that. Could Russian air defense have intercepted this strike if the network had been better integrated and more alert? With what we know about the route geometry and the vehicle signatures involved, the answer is possibly one or two vehicles, not the whole wave. The Ukrainian strike design had accounted for realistic Russian air defense performance, not theoretical maximum performance. Redundancy absorbed the losses that air defense achieved. And what would you have done differently? As a Ukrainian strike planner? Is there a route, a warhead choice, a timing window that would have made this operation more effective or more survivable for the vehicles involved? Drop your tactical analysis in the comments. We read every serious response. Were these the right decisions? Was this the right target? In military terms, yes. An ammunition depot supplying an entire frontline operational axis is among the highest value targets available for deep strike. The return on investment, measured in frontline artillery suppression, in logistics disruption, in the forced adaptation of Russian supply procedures, was exceptional. The question of whether it was the right target is less interesting than the question of why Russian planners believed it was safe. They believed it was safe because no one had ever done this before. No one had solved the 900-kilometer problem until they did. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The operations that happen in the dark, that don't make the front page until the satellite images come out days later. The tactics that change what's possible. The decisions, right and wrong, that shape how this war ends. The depot site is quiet now. The fire's burned out. The craters remain. And somewhere in Russian logistics planning documents, there are new guidelines about how far from the front line a depot must be to be considered safe. The number is higher than it used to be. It may never be high enough again. Real tactics, real consequences. Ukraine Radar.